When Sir Nicholas Hytner became director of the National Theatre in 2003, only the musicals were selling out, and its budget was based on being two-thirds full. By 2015, when he left, it was running at almost capacity. Its turnover exceeded £100 million, and one production, War Horse, will be seen by more than 7 million people worldwide. I'm sure plenty of you are listening today.
He writes in his memoir, Balancing Acts, Behind the Scenes at the National Theatre, the best reason for the state to help pay for art is because a vibrant society thrives on self-examination. The healthy state builds not just monuments, but the resources for its citizens to discover for themselves values that transcend the marketplace and to have a really good time. Sir Nicholas Hytner is here. And Nicholas,
Hi.
How receptive were Treasury officials to that particular line?
Oh, they were pretty receptive.
This was 2003, though, wasn't it?
Yeah, 2003. They were very receptive, and I had the good luck to become director of the National just when the purse strings were loosening. Wow. A succession of new Labour secretaries of state were very much in favour of broadening the appeal of the arts, even the high arts. But I got to say that under the coalition government, however fiercely George Osborne was cutting back everywhere else, and indeed however fiercely he cut the arts, he cut us less fiercely than he cut other departments. Osborne himself,
he was a consumer of the arts.
Was a great consumer of the arts. I mean, Osborne is living proof that the stereotype that politicians aren't interested is untrue. They don't talk about it very often, but he was a constant attender.
But also he was, of course, a consumer of, I guess, what would be described as establishment arts, wouldn't he? I mean, he loved the opera and he loved the theatre, the kind of arts that people such as yourself would like to be remoulded in a different sense, to not make it elitist and establishment.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what his tastes were. Places like the National Theatre, which are without doubt at the establishment.
Well, he's not an Eminem fan like Ian Duncan Smith. Were you?
No, neither am I. But although I'm kind of turned on by rap as a concept, I'm just not crazy about Eminem. The point about a place like the National Theatre is that it couldn't exist without all the small theatres all up and down the country, about the young people who make theatre, the young people who can just shove on a show in a room on top of a pub. Everything feeds into everything else. I was constantly on the lookout for the kind of work that existed in reaction against what we were doing. You know, it's no good everybody's settling into one way of doing things. There's got to be disagreement and experiment and a kind of constant state of revolution in the arts.
And that's something that you felt very strongly about when you took on this role, because am I right in thinking that you could have done the job before? It was certainly open for somebody new to step in, and you thought, no, I don't have a big enough idea.
Well, I didn't apply for it.
Yeah, for that reason.
When I might have done, I did apply for it when I thought I did have an idea.
And what was your big idea? Why didn't you have it before?
Well, I was an associate director of the National during the 90s when Richard Eyre was the director, and I thought he was doing it brilliantly, and I couldn't think of a different way of doing it. And it was only by stepping away for a few years that I started to see that there were things going on in the theatre, not in the big public spotlight. There were people making theatre, writing plays, putting plays together without necessarily starting with a script on a page, that really needed to be brought onto the bigger stage of the National Theatre. And I also thought that bluntly, the tickets were too expensive. And that's a constant struggle to keep ticket prices down. The reason they became too expensive was because during the late 80s and 90s, the funding tap was turned off and everybody was encouraged to charge what the market could bear. And if you do that, the market shrinks. So there was a real opportunity to do stuff that could get it out there again, and that's what I thought I would try to do when I came in.
And that's what you did do, the £10 ticket, as everybody now knows it. But those initial meetings, when you were suggesting that to people and talking to people about that idea, how receptive were they?
Well, the great thing was that there was spare capacity at the National, and this is still something that it's worth thinking about if you're running any kind of entertainment or performing arts organisation. It's better filling the seats at a lower price than having them empty and charging a premium price. So we had seats to fill. We thought it was possible to spend less on the shows and to fill the extra capacity and somehow come out even. And we also looked for sponsorship. That, funnily enough, was where there was a bit of opposition, because the kind of people who have the resources to sponsor the arts, they don't want to sponsor people like themselves. They were worried that they would maybe be digging their hands into their pockets to make cheap tickets affordable to people who could afford them anyway. To which I could only say, well, yeah, that's just something that you've got to live with, because we're not going to means test the audience. No. You're going to hope that by having thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, in fact, of cheap tickets, they will find their way to an audience pool that's bigger than the one we're playing to at the moment, and that is what happened with the help actually of a foreign exchange company called Travelex. Travelex, who sponsored the £10 seat, they kind of took out a copyright on the £10 note by doing so, and that was a good thing too.
And interesting enough with Travelex as well, it was a long-term commitment as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, they're still at it. It's £15 now, 15 years later, which is fair enough. But they're still at it. They've really stuck by the National Theatre, and a great thing is that other arts organisations saw that it worked and followed our example, and then the commercial theatre also realised a constant provision of affordable seats is not just good in itself, but it's good business.
There was a really fascinating line about yourself in the book where you describe how you're the kind of person who would say, well, that's a rubbish idea, that's never going to work. And then 10 minutes later it would go, that's absolutely genius, we should be doing that.
Yeah.
Just describe, over the 12 years at the National, did that change? I mean, how frustrating must that have been for the people around you?
Oh, they all knew. They all knew. they all rumbled me very quickly. I mean, they kind of knew that as soon as I dismissed their idea, they only had to set their watch for it to go ping 10 minutes later. Seriously, some ideas were terrible. And believe me, some of my ideas were terrible. Yeah. And it's not a management style I would recommend widely, but at least they knew.
Well, I've encountered it in my travels.
And I did always credit them with the idea later if I stole it. I think that's the thing that's most enraging. We all know that from experience.
Yep.
Someone stealing your idea and then claiming it was theirs in the first place.
So in those 10 minutes, what happens? I'm quite intrigued by that moment where you go, well, that's never going to work. And then what? You then start to cogitate and think,
that's exactly what happens. You start to think, actually, that's not so stupid after all. Actually, that might work really well. Oh, I can see how that's a little bit of genius there. Yes, we'll have that. That's but as I say, they just knew that if they put their head in the lion's mouth, they'd get their head snapped off, but I would give it back to them sooner or later.
Because you did that with Warhorse, didn't you? The first time you saw it, didn't think it was particularly... Was it too long? Dull?
I was right about that. Yeah. I wasn't wrong about that. But the thing about Warhorse was, the first preview of Warhorse was something like 3 3/4 hours long. It didn't take a genius to say, guys, you've got to cut these. Anybody in my position would have done that. And the thing I say in the book is, I could never, in my capacity as artistic director, turn a bad show into a good one. Warhorse was great. It was always great. It was just hiding within something that hadn't found its final form yet. And they needed a bad cop. They knew, the guys who made it, Marianne Elliott and Tom Morris, they didn't resist me. They were just perfectly properly looking out for the people who they were going to have to disappoint. The guy whose part got cut to the bone, the songs that were going to be edged out. They were worried, as you always are, and I know this from directing my own shows. You're always worried about keeping everybody committed to the original idea, not taking an actor's part away from her. It only needed me to nudge it, but the downside was that from Warhorse, which at its first preview, even Michael Morpurgo, the novelist on whose novel the show was based, even he thought it was a bit rum. Turning that round with Marianne and Tom doing all the work, then people used to think that if I just came in and growled a bit, I could turn even the worst show into a good one. But there are some shows where the most you can do is turn something bad into something mediocre. You can't wave a magic wand.
No, you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear.
That's
as my
exactly
granny
right,
would
yeah.
say. But I think I was reminded of how brutal it can be sometimes, and how often people do have to play the bad guys in theatre. Reading your book, because it opens with this great story about Michael Gambon being whisked off after feeling unwell. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, Michael Gambon is one of the funniest men you'll ever meet, and he's a great practical joker and a great hoaxer. But on this occasion, in a play by Alan Bennett called The Habit of Art, he keeled over in the middle of rehearsal. It turned out to be something very minor that only needed a few weeks recuperation, but we thought it was really serious. He turned grey, keeled over, fell into a chair. We had to wheel him out on a stretcher with oxygen, and as he was being taken from the ambulance to St Thomas's Hospital, the stage manager who'd gone with him said to him, would you like us to take a message back to rehearsal, Michael? And he said, don't worry about those bastards. They're already on the phone to Simon Russell Beale, who's another actor who he knew we would already be in touch with. And the horrifying thing is that, oh gosh, within 40 minutes of Michael keeling over, and we'd only just heard that actually he was fine. Yeah, we were recasting the part. He was absolutely right. We were on to the next person.
Can't have any sentimentality in that respect. You've got bums on seats, haven't you?
Yeah, we have. We've got always. There's always an opening night. You can't mess around. If there's an opening night, if there's a deadline, you've got to meet it. And although the theatre has a reputation for being rather fluffy and sentimental. No, we're absolute brutes. We're brutes.
well, let's talk about opening nights or not, and his dark materials. I mean, did that put you in therapy? Having to deal with his dark materials, the Philip Pullman adaptation, and just reading in the book what you all went through.
Yeah, his Dark Materials didn't have its first performance. It didn't have its first preview. It was scenically too ambitious, an enormous set, an enormous spectacle, and entirely my fault, hadn't given ourselves enough time. And as the first preview approached, the scenery was still getting stark, and one poor actor got virtually flattened behind a piece of scenery, which nearly caused a walkout of the other actors. It was as close to complete breakdown and disaster as certainly I, as a director, have ever come. We managed to cancel the first show in time to warn the audience, but then the second show also fell victim to the complexity of the set, and Philip Pullman volunteered to sit out front and sign his books for the disappointed kids. There were kids who were coming along, obviously, because the novel is so popular with teenagers. Yeah, that was pretty horrifying. We got there in the end, but only just.
Is there a kind of sadomasochistic thrill in that, in pushing yourself very much to the limits? I know you can do that creatively, but when it comes to his Dark Materials, it was you were being pushed to the limits on all different, logistics and everything.
Yeah, I think if I'd known exactly how it would
run
be,
away.
I wouldn't have done it quite that. I wouldn't do it quite that way a second time. Although by the time it was working, it was particularly when we brought it back for a second year, it felt like it was all worthwhile. But one of the great things about doing any show like that is with a big company, a lot of them young, is you see actors right at the beginning of their careers. And in that's 2003, his Dark Materials had, just off the top of my head, Dominic Cooper in his first part at the National Theatre, Anna Maxwell Martin, who is now such a wonderful actor on television as well as a theatre actor, in her first part. They were playing the two leads. And in a tiny part was Ben Whishaw.
Wow,
Just playing. I mean, Ben at one point was in drag as a witch, just in the background. And now watching the way those three careers have gone, that's one of the most exciting things about running a theatre. Being in on the beginning of major careers of not just actors but writers and directors as well.
Yeah, and your passion for them is very clear. You talk about watching them learn as young actors as well from the older hands, and that being a really beautiful thing to watch.
It is beautiful, and you know that's mutual. That's one of the things I've noticed over the years I've been in the theatre, that the smart young actors, and that's most of them, they can't take their eyes off people like Michael Gambon and Judi Dench and Maggie Smith. But if you watch the really great senior actors, they're always keeping a beady eye on the younger ones too, because they're thinking there's something new there. There's something they know that I don't know. If I just watch them, I might learn some new secrets that will keep me fresh. That's what the great actors like Judi Dench and Michael Gambon and Maggie Smith are always doing.
We've sort of touched on the fact that you can never tell what will be a hit, because otherwise you'd do it every time.
No one can in the arts.
But there was a sense, wasn't there, with the History Boys, very, very, very early on, that something very special was happening. And this is, of course, Alan Bennett, your great friend and collaborator.
Yeah, I've had the incredible good fortune to have done all Alan's plays since I first worked with him in, I think, 1990. The History Boys, when I usually don't know what he's up to, because he likes to keep his cards very close to his chest.
He just posts it through your door and then that's it.
That's exactly what he does mostly. When I first read it, I knew it was brilliant. I knew it had the most fantastic, dazzling dialogue. But I thought it was rather esoteric. I thought there's a lot of very witty but quite highbrow discussion here of literature, of history, of the purpose of education. I had no idea it would be such a huge, stonking hit. But halfway through rehearsals, when I kind of experienced the energy of the 8 young actors playing these A-level students, when I started to realize exactly what they gave off when they were working together. Another one where, oh goodness, that was James Corden's first. James Corden had a small part in that, and Russell Tovey was another one of them. Richard Griffiths was playing the old schoolmaster. Francis de la Tour was playing the history teacher. Halfway through rehearsal, I kind of got a whiff of it, and the very first time we put it in front of an audience, I keep referring, I realize, to this first preview. Generally at the National, we did 6 previews. All that means is we get 6 shows before the press comes in and decides what they think of it. But within 5 minutes, you could just tell sometimes there's an alchemy. There's something that happens between the stage and the auditorium, and they rode the crest of that wave for 2.5 hours. It was the show the audience wanted to see. Now, that is not something you can predict, but obviously, if you could, you'd do it every time. Sometimes the opposite happens. I'm not going to say which show, but I remember very clearly a show where we had the most wonderful time in rehearsal. Everybody was convinced it was a complete cracker. And within 5 minutes, I was sat at the first preview thinking, they don't want to be told this story. They don't like this show. They're not really going with it. And those are very, very hard to turn around.
Did it tank, or did it?
It did tank, that one, yeah. I mean, not tank as
No.
it was just, it was what the Americans would call meh. It was one of those.
Okay. I'm mindful of a quote in the book, Sir Laurence Olivier, which said, "The National Theatre can never be what the public wants if it isn't allowed sometimes to be what the public doesn't want." Taking that line, and perhaps, I don't know if you took that to heart when you started or not, how would that have developed, perhaps in your own philosophy for what the National Theatre is to
Well,
be?
I think that is a really pithy way of saying that you have to go with what the artists you respect want to do.
Right.
You can't second guess the public. In fact, if you do give the public what the public wants, they turn out not to want it, because that's what they got last time. They want to be shown something new every time. They want to be taken into a new world, along a new road. And the only way you can do that is by respecting, embracing where the great playwrights, the great directors want to go. Inevitably, sometimes they will want to go in a direction the public doesn't want to follow them on. But I think more often they will do something completely surprising, and that's what the audience likes best. They like to be taken by surprise, and they like to feel that the voice they're listening to is a real voice with something to say, not a voice that simply wants to simper and to offer them stuff they know already.
You admit to a couple of things that you would have liked to have done more of during your tenure. One of them was getting more female directors and even more particularly writers, because the National's record, I think before you arrived, was pretty bad.
Too slow, but by the time I was done, the last couple of years, there were more women writing plays than men, and I think although it did take too long, we certainly got there. And
why did it take so long?
Well, partly because things need to be commissioned and developed, and from a standing start where there was virtually nothing going on, it took a few years to crank it all up. But I think probably in retrospect, we could have just kicked harder to get more of those plays onto the stages. But as I say, at least we got the last few years. It was much better. In the last 2 years, actually, there were, I think, 16 to 14 new plays, women to men.
You've said that you don't like getting into arguments, particularly, and you'll sidestep them if you can. But you must have had to have been the bad guy quite a few times. Have there been any memorable experiences that you wished you didn't have to go through, telling people things that you didn't want to have to tell them?
Well, the worst possible thing is to tell someone that you're not going to do their play. In an ideal world, you would produce every play you commission. Obviously, you can't produce every play that gets posted to the theatre. About 1,000 plays a year came to the National Theatre. Which were all read, and very often if they came from someone with great promise, the writer would be brought in and given space at a studio down the road from the National Theatre, maybe to write another play, to spread their wings, to get more experience. But the stuff we produced tended to be stuff we commissioned. Sometimes you commission a play that isn't everything you hoped for. And the best thing to do then, if you can't produce it with conviction, is to hope that someone else will produce it. But that was never pleasant, saying,
No.
I'm really sorry that the play we really wanted you to write and we wanted to do, we're not doing after all.
And quite tricky, presumably, to deal with somebody as big as Harold Pinter, who wanted you to do a revival of his play Celebration, and you said no.
Well, yeah. Harold Pinter had stopped writing by the time I became director of the National Theatre.
It was a revival. Yeah.
He suggested that we might like to revive a short play that he'd had produced at the small theatre in Islington, the Almeida Theatre, really quite recently. And this was Harold Pinter, so I didn't dare simply say to his face, no, that's not a good idea, Harold, and that was just done a couple of years ago and it's only half an hour long. So I told him it was an interesting idea, and about 3 years later I ran into him in a restaurant and he turned on me in language that I couldn't begin to describe at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the BBC.
Possibly at any time on the BBC.
No, I think probably even past the watershed. But it ended with liar, and it involved a lot of the F word and very loud in a restaurant, very, very loud in a restaurant. I was with a designer called Bob Crowley having dinner after a design meeting, and she told me it was a rite of passage that you can't possibly be director of the National Theatre until you've been bawled out by Harold Pinter in a restaurant. But listen, the sequel to that story is a year or two after that, we did do a new production, a revival of one of Harold Pinter's earliest plays, The Hot House. And he behaved with such tact and grace. There was an actor who was in trouble, as very occasionally actors get into trouble. They can't get the part into their heads. And this very experienced, really good actor was having huge trouble learning the part. And at the first performance, needed to take 40 or 50 prompts.
Wow.
And it was probably the most difficult night I spent in the theatre during my 12 years. This poor actor went to pieces. And I met Harold afterwards and the director of the play, and honestly, I thought it was going to be a nuclear cataclysm. And Harold said, again, I'm going to have to dial down the language a bit, but he
Please
said
do.
it's a bloody hard job acting. I've done it. I've been an actor. It's bloody hard. Tell him if he can't remember the line, make it up. Just he knows what he's doing. He can make it up. He can make it up. He'll be fine. And that vote of confidence from Harold Pinter, telling the actor, you can make it up if you want to, almost overnight, all the problems were solved. Within a couple of nights, the same actor was remembering everything.
Blind.
So that was, but that another moral of that story is how so many of the best writers have themselves been actors. They know what it's like to get out on a stage in front of 1,000 people, and speak the lines. And Harold Pinter was indeed an actor at the beginning of his career.
If you look back on your 12 years, Nick, at the National, do you think you succeeded? And we've already talked about the £10 tickets, but do you think you succeeded in eroding the image of the theatre as being an elitist place?
Oh, I hope so. You never succeed in anything as much as you want to. I think you'd know this as broadcasters. You're constantly driven by a sense of failure, of wanting to do it better next time, of nothing ever being as good as you want it to be. But I think the doors did open, but the great thing is that after 12 years, I stepped aside and a new team came in. And I think what they saw was more or less what I saw when I started 12 years earlier. They saw a place where the really fresh, the groundbreaking youngsters hadn't arrived yet. So that's why it's so important with something like the National Theatre or a gallery or a great broadcaster, that the people on top don't stay too long, because it's always necessary, however well things seem to be going, it's always necessary that someone comes in and says, no, sorry, that's really boring, we've got a better idea. That's probably not just in the creative industries. It's why it's a good idea to kick a government out after 5 years, but now I'm probably straying into places.
Well, you're allowed to have political opinions,
you're
but
not
the
saying
national,
necessarily this
you also,
government.
you've already, you bigged up
Maybe
George
I am.
Osborne and you big up Ed Vasey in the book, so
Yeah,
it shows
so
that
there you go.
yourself
I'm very, very even-handed.
balanced.
Yeah.
But you did say that the National Theatre has no responsibility to be fair and balanced in its approach to anything. There is a perception, of course, that Theatreland is very left-wing. Is that a fair
I think
appraisal of the world that you live in?
I stand by the idea that no artist, no creative enterprise needs to be fair and balanced. That's the business of journalism, not the business of the creative arts.
But so one-sided as the perception is of theatre, and indeed the arts.
Yeah, I think the arts are always skeptical. They tend to be skeptical of authority. But one of the things I challenge in the book is whether left wing and right wing are adequate categories to describe the arts. I'm not sure they are adequate categories to describe anything these days, politics included.
Global and local seems to be.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. And I was never happier than when I was allowing stuff onto the stage that challenged a kind of lazy, bien-pensant consensus. And those challenges didn't necessarily come from the left or the right. They came from artists, writers mostly, who wanted to stir things up a bit. And that I certainly always enjoyed doing.
Just one thing about class as well, very quickly. Do you think over the 12 years you saw a diversification in people of different classes coming to this? It's been a great challenge in film, in television, in theatre, as it seems the perception is that it's becoming essentially more and more middle class. Everybody is always running to catch up with the diversity of our community, because the community changes and it takes a while before artists or even journalists notice. So you're always behind. As far as this thing about it's been about actors in particular being too middle class. I can't put my hand on my heart and say that I know. I didn't very often ask people what class they came from. When I got close to them, when they became friends, they seemed pretty diverse to me. I don't think a single member of the company, I think one... But it was important for women, but not for class?
One actor in the History Boys, because you can tell, by and large, mostly, you can tell, man or woman.
You tend to say someone from a comprehensive school and someone from a nice boarding school, can't you?
You can't. Actors, they come out of drama school and a lot of it has been rubbed off. They can access this they can get access to it if they want to. They can disguise it if they want to for another show. That's what their business is, being whoever you ask them to be. Yeah. As I said, the company of the History Boys, 16, 4 teachers, 8 pupils. Only one of them was privately educated. I think this whole business there's been a spectacular success for a handful of very talented old Etonians, but at the same time, a much bigger community of people who aren't old Etonians, who are perfectly regular, state-educated men and women. Their careers have blossomed as well. I think if you, I don't know. I'm going to risk saying this, and I have no idea, but I bet if you asked last night's BAFTA winners where they went to school, you'd find they were a lot more diverse than the current mythology would insist.
David from Birmingham texts to say the National Theatre at the Cinema, National Theatre Live, is fantastic for those of us who can't or don't want to go to London. Thank you, David. That's also something that Sir Nicholas pioneered. Listen, you're just about to open a new theatre, the first commercial theatre in London for 80 years. I don't know if I'm reliably informed or not. It's called The Bridge. You're a brave man. How are you feeling about it?
Hasn't got a garden on it.
Well, it hasn't. It's at Tower Bridge on the Thames with a fantastic view of Tower Bridge and the Tower of London. I'm very, very nervous and very excited. Who wouldn't be nervous? It is the first addition to the commercial theatre stock for 80 years, and it is, we think, in any kind of living memory, the first commercial theatre outside the West End. That's the big idea. In London, must the commercial theatre only be in the West End, within a stone's throw of Piccadilly Circus or Leicester Square? And we think not. We think London has greatly changed, and there's no reason why we can't give it a go in this rather wonderful new building next to the river at Tower Bridge. But it is nerve-wracking. If it doesn't work, we'll go bust and we'll go out of business. There's no, we're obviously not looking for any kind of state support, and we're not looking for any kind of philanthropic support either. We're going to try and make it work as a business. But as I say in the book,
But you've clearly put your whole savings into it, have you?
Well,
Miss Saigon is.
well, we've
the money
raised a
you
lot.
made from
We've raised a lot of money from investors who
Right.
who will be looking for a return the way investors do. But then, that's the roots of our theatre. On the South Bank 400 years ago, Shakespeare was one of 6 shareholders in his company. They were called first the Lord Chamberlain's Men and then the King's Men, who relied entirely on the box office. Occasionally they went and performed for the Queen at court, and they got a little bit in return from the Queen, and they needed a bit of patronage from the court, but they did it for money. They were business people. Shakespeare famously, when he was rich enough, retired to Stratford and stopped writing plays. I think one of the great features of the London theatre is that it's never really recognised a distinction between art and entertainment. You can say serious, challenging, difficult things and at the same time tell a good story. You can take your audience to the edge of despair like Shakespeare does, and then give them a guy who comes on with some stand-up comedy. The dividing line between show business and high art has never been remotely firm in our theatre, and that's just a feature of what we do. If you look at, for instance, the French theatre, it's either high tragedy or high comedy, and it has for a very, very long time been the property of an educated elite. It was taken over by the court quite early on in its history, but our theatre has always had this sense of popular rough and tumble. It's been part of popular discourse. So that's what my producing partner Nick Starr and I, that's what we reckon we can do. We hope produce plays that are both, on the one hand, entertaining and appealing, and on the other hand, ambitious and new. What we won't be doing is a lot of the kind of stuff I was able to do at the National Theatre, the really groundbreaking experimental stuff, which you play to people who are already, as it were, part of the circle. They know about the cutting edge of the theatre. A lot of the most interesting stuff needs to be done in very small theatres for 90, 100 people at a time, and that's what a place like the National Theatre or the Royal Court Theatre or the Almeida Theatre or a lot of the really interesting regional theatres are about. But we're going to be trying for something that has a wider appeal than that.
You're listening to a BBC 5 Live podcast.
If you like this, you might also like this.
Kermode and Mayo's film review. If you don't know your app from your elbow, boom tish, here all week, tip your waitress.
To find out more about our range of podcasts, click, tap or swipe bbc.co.uk/5live.